In 1961, I was 17 and had just graduated from Mount Hermon. I left for Europe in the fall and returned a year later. That year changed everything for me. Luckily, during the summer before I left, two things happened unexpectedly to me. One, I drank a beer, a Schmitz from Philadelphia. And two, I danced to Ray Charles, See the Woman with the Red Dress On. It happened simultaneously at a party in Dirk Munt's barn. His parents were away and so were mine. Several of my band members from Mount Hermon were visiting. We got back to the house at 2:45. So we sang that song that was popular then, at the top of our lungs. Don't you know that I dance till 2:45. I didn't expect to have a beer, but I guess it had been building up in me. And the twists had just come in, and it was pretty easy. So that happened too. I say it was lucky because I needed to have those things done to be ready to go to Europe. We sailed on the Swedish luxury liner, the Gripsholm, in early October. I fell in with some Swedish kids and fell in love with a Swedish girl named Kirsten. The activity of the group was mainly teaching me Swedish words and expressions and then amazing people with my parroting ability. It was fun. I'd been adamant about not learning Danish. Hey, only 4 million people speak it. But I started to rethink that. My father had a Fulbright to teach in Aarhus, Denmark. And of course my younger brother and sister were going along. I needed a place to learn how to play the bass, so I went along too. I was already accepted to Oberlin College, but at the last minute realized that I had to be a musician. So I told them that I wanted to be in the 5-year program as a bass player. No problem. Since you already have a space, just come and audition. What if I'm in Europe? Then just make a tape. That sounded a whole lot better since I couldn't play at all. To be more accurate, I had been standing behind a bass since I was 12, and I could read music from playing the piano and clarinet, but actual bass playing like you would learn from a teacher, nothing. So I decided to go to Denmark and take my chances. We moved into a house in Risko at number 9 Fyrkløvervej. I began looking for a bass teacher. I had an interview with an old fart bass player who taught at the conservatory, Herr Müller. I could tell he didn't want to be bothered. Luckily. But he suggested a young bass player who had just been named solo bass in the Aarhus City Orchestra, Bent Golsen. He was 27 and I was 17. He agreed, and this was the first of a million lucky things that happened to me this year. He was incredibly thoughtful and precise and very clear in how to play, but spoke almost no English. In the first lesson, he wanted me to relax, so he demonstrated relaxing. What is this? Slouching, I said. Okay then, slouch. Meanwhile, I was zooming ahead in the Teach Yourself Danish book that my parents had. An old fart teacher came once a week to teach us, but neither of my parents could pronounce a single word in Danish. I was out in the neighborhood practicing with the children. They loved my first lesson. Mit navn er Jens Hansen. Der er mange mennesker i Danmark som hedder Hansen. My name is Jens Hansen. There are many people in Denmark named Hansen. I soon caught up to Bent and our lessons switched to Danish. I also joined several orchestras. In December, I flew to Copenhagen with my friend Peter Vogt, a cellist from the Conservatory Orchestra. It was my first time in an airplane. We stayed with some family of his, and I noticed to my amazement that I could suddenly follow their conversations. Then at the end of the month, I played the Messiah with an amateur orchestra and chorus in the Domkirche, and made a tape to send to Oberlin. It all seemed so easy. Just before Christmas, Graham Cole and Warren Ferris, two of my friends from Mount Hermon, showed up. They were doing a year of postgrad public school in England. They were going skiing at Westendorf, a little village in Austria. We had decided to travel together down to Munich. I was on my way to an intensive German language school in Köchel, Switzerland, where my brother Jonathan had gone a few years earlier. He raved about how much fun it was. We hung out in Aarhus for a week and went to the jazz club Pan Am. Then we boarded a train for Hamburg, where we visited the Reeperbahn, the red light district. Exciting and creepy. Then on to Munich. We spent a day walking around, went to a museum, the city white and beautiful under a new snowfall. Another day we took a bus to Dachau to see the crematorium. Like everyone of my generation, we were obsessed and horrified by World War II and the Nazis. The young woman who sold us the ticket asked us why we wanted to go there. We're interested. Oh yes, that would be very interesting for you. Her voice filled with venom. Then in the train station I had a conversation with my dad back in Denmark, who told me that the Goethe Institute in Köchel had lost my application and the program was full. The soonest they had an opening was a month later in Blaubeuren, Germany. I checked my trusty plywood base in the train station there in Munich and set off to go skiing with Graham and Warren. The first stop was Vienna, where we stayed at the Zum Golden Bear, which we thought was hysterically funny. We heard a New Year's Eve concert of the 6 Brandenburg concertos and actually saw Rosenkavalier at the State Opera, obstructed view for about 45 cents. On our last day, we sat out in a park and had wine, bread, and cheese. I remember the cheese really clearly, but not what it was called. That night, we boarded the overnight train for Westendorf, which was completely full. One of us got a seat in a packed compartment, and the other two sat on our suitcases in the corridor. Pretty soon, we all began farting these horrendous and overpowering farts. And soon after, the compartment emptied, and we were reunited in it, and we could lie down in the seats. Sure, we had to endure the farts, but soon we were asleep. I loved Westendorf. The Post Hotel, George the manager, the zither band in the bar for après-ski. The young barmaid we all loved, but got nowhere with, who said she wanted to live somewhere flat. Raimund, my ski teacher, who gave me an anorak because I had no clothes to ski in. Fifi and Philippa, white Rhodesians who taught me a song in the tribal language of Rhodesia. The disco at night where I taught everyone to do the twist. Apparently, Westendorf specialized in British tourists, offering packages of hotels, ski rentals, lift tickets, and lessons. I must have bought some form of package, but soon people leaving were giving me their unused tickets. At the end, I was paying nothing. None of us had ever skied before, but I immediately seemed to get the hang of it. I think it was the kind of step-by-step instruction that made it possible. Graham and Warren were varsity athletes, but they both had a lot of trouble with it. Most boys learn sports skills at a young age without any real instruction. I didn't, but maybe could have with that kind of teaching. Or maybe it was just time for me finally. Graham and Warren left after 2 weeks and I stayed on. Most of the Brits were older than I was, and they sort of adopted me. One day I fell on an icy patch and cut the second biggest artery in my leg with the metal edges of my wooden skis. Blood was pouring out of my boot. There was a nurse in our group, and she immediately had me on my back with my leg in the air. Two guys from the ski patrol put me in a sled with my head in the downhill end and skied me down this narrow, icy path, and they kept taking turns falling. It was pretty dramatic. The local doctor put some metal clamps on the cut and said, "No skiing for 3 days." On the 4th day, I couldn't get a hold of him, so I went out anyway. I figured if they come out, I'll have to leave in any case, so what the hell? Of course, I could have bled to death, too. I got back after skiing, and the doctor had been frantically looking for me all over town, kind of panic-stricken. At the end of the month, I won the ski school race. I still have the pin. I spent a couple of nights near the train station in München, a weird, lonely time after the frantic, wonderful days in Westendorf. Then I took the train with my base to the tiny village of Blaubeuren and soon got into the rhythm of the school. Classes morning and afternoon, students from around the world: Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Sudan, Ghana, India, Australia, Turkey, Spain, France, a large group of 10 Paraguayans, and only 2 women, both from Italy. Again, I was the youngest and one of only 2 Americans, as well as a Salvadoran who had grown up partly in Springfield, Mass, named Andres Martinez, Martini as we called him. Hanging around but not taking classes was a Chilean. My housemates were Sharif from Sudan and Papalardo from Paraguay. I found German easy. It's very organized and the pronunciation very easy compared to Danish. I didn't know how to react when all the other students wanted to copy my quizzes and tests. I probably seemed strange to them. They couldn't understand my reluctance. I began playing in a student orchestra in the cathedral by the side of the Blaubeuren, the spring that was the source of the Danube. My friends would help me carry the bass from the house. We were working on the double violin concerto of Vivaldi. One day, the whole school took the day off to go to the festival in Rottweil. Everyone was in love with Lorenza Dardanello, one of the Italians. Actively pursuing her were a Frenchman, a Spaniard, a very tall Sudanese, and me. At some point, I managed to sit next to her, at least for a while. But more importantly, I managed to get the seat next to her on the bus home. It reminded me of bus rides at night when I was in high school. Ideal for talking to girls. We fell into the habit of purposely mixing up French and German. My high school French and incipient German, with a little English thrown in. She spoke excellent French and was in a more advanced class in German, but didn't have much English. Apparently, I had won the competition, which she never acknowledged. I invited her on a midnight hike to the ruined castle above the town. To my surprise, she accepted. I threw a stone on her window and she snuck out. No one ever knew. Then on the weekend, she suggested that we hitch to wherever the ride took us, just for the hell of it. After walking for hours, we landed in Stuttgart. We had many adventures, including getting caught up in a demonstration against atomic weapons. Getting home was more of a problem. It was night, and we asked an older couple at a gas station for a ride. First, the woman asked if we had any pistols. We said no. Lorenza opened her bag. Of course we would have said no, even if we had had some. We had a good laugh about that. They ended up taking us all the way to Blaubeuren, while Lorenza slept in my arms. The last trip we took was a walk to Ulm, 18K. We didn't make it the whole way, and it was late, so we spent the night in a tiny shed that I managed to get open. It snowed while we slept under my coat in each other's arms. In the morning, we climbed to the top of the Cathedral of Ulm and threw off a sausage. We vowed to do a Dummheit, something silly, every day from now on. I was 18 and she was 22. We were deeply in love, but never kissed. I also started going to pubs, mainly with Martini. I bought a book, Spanish in 30 Tagen, Spanish in 30 days, and had a lesson a day with him while drinking beer in the Bierstube. Often we were joined by Gamali, the Egyptian architect, who told an endless stream of jokes about Nasser. We called them Shaggy Nasser stories. Some nights I went to a cafe with all the Arabs, who taught me how to clap and did tricks with knives. They played these two songs on the jukebox over and over. One night, the director of the school, Dr. Kurtz, had a classical music evening and played records. He played the Brahms Violin Concerto and the Beethoven Seventh Symphony, neither of which I had ever heard. As the end of my 2 months there drew close, a few of us, mainly me, hatched a plan to have a hot dog roast up on a small cliff near the town to celebrate our finishing the course. We had cards printed up, and we dressed up and handed them out to all the shop girls in Blaubeuren. We were an exotic group, including 2 Turks and Kaila the Sikh with his turban. We laughed a lot, and we had the roast. I think 2 girls came that we already knew, but none of the invited guests. My relationship with Lorenzo was secret. My trip back to Denmark was bold. When I changed my last traveler's check, I found I only had 38 marks, and I still had to ship my base. I could have asked my parents to wire me more money, but I had a desire to test myself on the open road. Papalardo and Fuster gave me some bread and cheese and salami with a bottle of wine. I paid for my base as far as Ulm, and the guy said I could go with it for free. It's a spur line. I would have to ship it again from Ulm. So I took the train with Chudar and Achalek, the 2 Turks, and Samudio from Paraguay. They wanted to hitch with me, the Turks to Stuttgart and Samudio to Cologne. They bought me lunch in Ulm. Then as it was raining, the Turks backed out, and I was stuck with Samudio, a strange and troubled character. I never would have invited him to come with me, but I was maneuvered into it because of my friendship with the Turks. We walked the 10K out to the Autobahn, and then got a ride to Stuttgart. I stole a knife to cut the cheese and salami in the station, and we ate on a bench in the park. After that, we were chased out of a cafe and then out of the train station by the police for trying to sleep. Finally, we walked out to the Autobahn at midnight in the rain, and more police wished us well, but didn't think anyone would stop. They were right. It wasn't raining that hard, so I lay down on the ground and went to sleep. Samudio disappeared and returned with a cab, which he bundled me into. He had bought tickets to Cologne, and I woke up there. I would have been okay with him paying for it, but it turned out he wanted his money back, and I wished he had let me sleep where I was. We walked around a bit, and he told me his wife was unfaithful to him, and that I was his only friend, and cried. He was a bookkeeper in Paraguay, but was telling everyone that he was a medical student from Chile. I went into a cafe and had a coffee, and I was writing on the beer mat that I was using as a diary, and a young student offered me a piece of paper. Soon we were talking, and he invited me home for lunch. But his parents were out, so he took me to his father's butcher shop and gave me Wurst. Unfortunately, it was liverwurst, which I hate. He drove me out to the Autobahn, and I got a ride to Dusseldorf, where the driver managed to find the address that Gamali had given me. But it was his boss's work address, and the boss was away, and no one knew where Gamali was. So I went to the train station to look for a place to sleep. Eventually, I was startled by some students asking me if I was at home here. I thought they were referring to the fact that I was sitting on the Express Gepäck counter. But no, they wanted to help me and gave me a letter to a student house where I could sleep. The next day, I made it to Hamburg. I checked my address book for friends of my older brother Jonathan from when he'd been in Switzerland a year or two earlier. I found a Wolfgang Skuta in Hamburg, but it didn't say if he was a close friend or just an acquaintance. I bought a beer and asked the waitress where his address was. 2 blocks away. I took it as a sign. After some awkwardness at the door, his family took me in and fed me. The next morning, Wolfgang gave me a tour of Hamburg, bought me lunch, and took me by bus to the edge of town. I got several rides, the last one with 2 students who had been in the States. I paid for the base from Ulm to Flensburg, where I was, the border town, and sent it on to Aarhus, and then didn't have enough money for my suitcase. It weighed a ton, full of books. I tried to take a bus to Aarhus. I had some Danish money, but it was too late. I didn't have enough for a streetcar, so I walked with the suitcase to the address of one of the students, 5th floor. The name on the apartment was not his, probably his father's, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, I couldn't ring the bell. So I slept there on the floor. The paper girl woke me, and that day I made it all the way back to Denmark and Fyrkløvervej. By this time, I could actually speak German. I'd gotten the grammar in Blaubeuren, but it was really on this trip that I was able to put it together in conversation form. Most of the time, I passed as a Dane so as not to have to speak English. Where are you going? Denmark. They just assumed I was Danish. Not counting the base, I'd spent 5 marks in 5 days, worth about $1.25 at the time. And boy, was it fun. When I got back to Denmark, I was really in demand as a bass player. I played in the Aarhus Privatorkester, Jens Højes Musikskoleorkester, Conservatoriumsorkester, a Dixieland band of medicine students, and my favorite, Den Jysk Akademisk Orkester. We played this piece, The Swan of Tuonela by Sibelius. The conservatory put on Kurt Weill's short opera Down in the Valley, and after the performance, as we were all drinking beer and celebrating, I met Inger Jensen. We danced, then kissed, and became a couple. My stand partner, the jazzer Paul Ehler, said, "Du hast gut Papagoyen. You have shot the parrot." I convinced Inga to hitch with me to the west coast. We slept in the sand dunes and were awakened by a cow. She lived only a short walk from us, near the forest, but her landlady didn't want late-night visitors, so I would throw a pebble at her window, getting to be a habit. I still wrote to Lorenza and hoped to see her again, but we had never declared ourselves. Inga, like Lorenza, was also older than I was. She was a piano and organ student at the conservatory. During the 2 months I was with her, I really learned to speak Danish. She was wonderful. Towards the end of my time, I went with members of the Akademisk Orkester to a rented cabin for a chamber music weekend. All during this year, I had been carrying my bass on my bike. I put the pillow over the handlebars, hung the stool on the bike rack, put the neck under my arm and the bouts on the pillow. The bell, which I now couldn't reach, began wearing a hole in the bout of hell. It was a cheap plywood base. The real problem was that my turning radius was cut down dramatically. One night, I went on my bike to the Munkagate school to rehearse. It was in an old part of town that I didn't know well, and all of a sudden I noticed that the narrow street I was on had streetcar tracks. Then a streetcar appeared coming towards me. There was just enough clearance to make it between the parked cars and the streetcar. Woohoo! After that, they had to pick me up. Then on one of my last nights, we had a typical Danish tea, and I invited all my musician friends. We had whipped cream cake, and I made a speech. It was hard to say goodbye to Inga, but I was off to seek my fortune. I left my base for my parents to take home on a freighter. I wouldn't see it until days before I entered conservatory. Amazingly, my tape was good enough to get me in. I had no idea. Music had always been easy for me. I wanted to see Europe, so not practicing for 3 months seemed reasonable to me. Like I said, I had no idea. My plan was to go to Paris and reawaken the French that I'd studied since the 5th grade, but which had disappeared in the learning of Danish, German, and Spanish. I also had vague plans to meet Peter, who was the other American in Blaubeuren, but who had left with Sergio Ovalle, the Chilean, to hitch around Sweden. We were to meet via the American Express office. What made this 3-month odyssey so amazing was that in those days, no Americans hitchhiked in Europe. The young Americans traveling were typically college graduates who would buy a car, usually a Volkswagen, and drive it around before selling it or shipping it home. People were amazed to find an 18-year-old American out on the roads. I had not joined the youth hostel program yet, so when my rides would ask, "Where are you staying?" I would mumble something vague about finding a cheap hotel or sleeping outside. Invariably, I got invited home with them. It was exhilarating and exciting, and I felt invincible. I left on June 1st, a beautiful spring day. Somewhere near the German border, I was picked up by a Danish tourist bus headed for Germany. The driver was asking me where I was going, and the others shouted, "Tell han dansk eller tysk?" I was, of course, speaking Danish. "Dansk!" So everyone cheered. There was still an incredible resentment toward the Germans for the occupation, which lasted for quite a long time. We stopped briefly at this memorial, something from the war. I'd bought a cheap guitar for the trip. It seemed like a necessity, and I'd learned a few songs like "Summertime," "Michael Row the Boat Ashore," "Sloop John B.," stuff like that. But the first day, I met a German boy who took my guitar and taught me this piece. Later, I was picked up by a family going home to Dusseldorf. My German was okay. They told me to come to their apartment if I couldn't get a ride, so I did. The next day, I only made it to Namur, Belgium. This couple was taking me to a hotel, but at the last minute took me home with them. Man, my French was bad. On the French border, I was picked up by a couple who took me home with them. After a few days, I asked if I could stay with them for the month, and added that I would of course pay them for it. I had shot another parrot. Monsieur Anton was Dutch-German, grew up in England, married to a French woman. They lived in Le Vésinet, a rich suburb just west of Paris. They had 2 children, Patrick and Monique, who I immediately fell in love with. They were both some 10 years older than I was. Mornings, after my café au lait, I would take the commuter train from the little station and then metro over to l'Alliance Française for French class. I had taken private French lessons with a Swiss woman since the 5th grade, which was really fun. Then 4 years of high school French, which I hated. So it came back almost immediately, and the family Anton all spoke French with me to help me learn. I met another Dick, as I was mostly called back then, from Canada, and we started hanging out in the afternoons. We'd pick some famous spot in Paris and walk to it. We managed to see pretty much everything in a month. Then we'd stop at a cafe for coffee or a beer. One day I left him at a cafe where, after he left, an Algerian terrorist attacked patrons with a knife. Old school terrorist. I'd take the train from Gare Saint-Lazare back in time for an exquisite dinner cooked by the grand-mère, during which Madame and Monsieur would vie with each other to promote their favorite wines. She was from Bourgogne, so those were her favorites, and he liked rosé from Provence. Bottled sunshine, he would say. During that period of the Algerian Revolution, we would watch Charles de Gaulle on TV speaking to the nation. Français, Françaises, vive la République, vive la France! People say that the French are not welcoming of foreigners, especially Americans. But I was made an honorary member of Les Fifis, a group of friends of Patrick and Monique's. The most charismatic was a former adjutant to a general who managed to get engaged to the general's daughter. On weekends, we made the picnic and played boule. They called me La Jeune Amérique, Young America. It struck me that when we went out for drinks, some people had coffee and other milk, sometimes a beer. In tango was a beer with some kind of disgusting red syrup in it. I loved those. Patrick ran the equipment for the simul-translations at conferences. He took me along one time to a chateau where there were multiple languages being translated. I tracked down Peter and Sergio, who were living in a home for African students. One day, Dick and I were at the Louvre, and I spotted this unbelievably beautiful woman. I followed her for a while, but didn't speak to her. The next day, Sergio introduced us to her, Laura Gonzalez from Chile, of course. Another time we met Victor Hugo, also from Chile. He was soliciting money from passers-by for a chalk drawing on the sidewalk that he hadn't painted. When the real artists, two Spaniards, showed up. Luckily, nobody got hurt. Later, I started singing to a bunch of children in a park. On the metro the next day, an American couple asked me where I would be singing that night. Nowhere. I also found Jean-Claude Gagnon at the Bourse, who I'd met in Westendorf. He couldn't believe that I now spoke French fluently when I could barely say bonjour in Austria. He fixed me and Dick up with dates for an evening which led nowhere. I experienced one of the great transportation workers' strikes and was caught in Paris for 3 days, unable to get back to Le Vésinet. One night I spent on the floor of some Americans I met on the street. One of the women was Andy Kerr's granddaughter, the most famous football coach in Colgate history, in Hamilton, New York, where I grew up. I miscalculated on the rent payment. Thinking that they weren't going to ask for anything, I went out and bought a bunch of expensive gifts, including a set of Danish coffee cups and saucers. Then Madame asked for a reasonable sum, but it put me a little short for the rest of the trip. On July 6th, I set out to meet Sergio and Peter in Pamplona, Spain, for the Bull Festival, La Fiesta de San Fermín. I ate lunch in a park in Biarritz. And then I got one of the coolest rides of my life, with a couple who had just been married, and the best man was driving them from the church to start their honeymoon. I got to Pamplona that day and slept in a campground, just on the ground with no sleeping bag or tent or anything, but they still made me leave my passport in the office. The next day I found Sergio and Peter. They had bought these old-style bowler Charlie Chaplin hats in a flea market in Paris, and had used them in Sweden as a gimmick to get rides. Their friend Hélène Vellet had the third one, which Sergio later promised me. Going to bullfights was a daily event. Sergio had figured out how to sneak in. I was entranced by the grace and danger of the kill. It's really unlike anything else. I bought a wineskin, a bota, which you could get filled in a bar from giant wine bottles. You had to swallow with your mouth open to drink from it, which I soon learned. At the bullfights, people would spontaneously pass them along. Everywhere, day and night, you would see these little bands, usually two oboe-like horns with a drummer and a group of mostly men and boys dancing along behind them. You could be sitting in a park having a roll for breakfast, and they'd come around a corner, obviously from playing and dancing the whole night. Peter and Sergio would ask girls if they could take a picture with them, and the girls mostly agreed. Sergio had stacks of pictures of girls, most of whom he didn't really know. Sometimes it led to more. One morning, I was watching the parade of giant heads, and I spotted a beautiful young Spanish girl who was shopping by herself. I started talking to her, and we realized that we both spoke pretty good French. She mentioned that she hated Americans, so I became Danish. Nobody hates them. We arranged to meet the next morning, and then she invited me to join her group of 8. In those days, in very conservative Catholic Spain, young people were not allowed to see each other, unsupervised, except in groups of 8. I kept walking into these things. Actually, we ended up being a group of 10. I went out with them every afternoon. It was fun. I started running into this English kid, who was also named Richard, mi tocayo, as they say in Spanish. One day we went for coffee and a pastry, and somehow I ended up paying. What? How did he do that? I thought I was good. Sergio and Peter were staying in a house on the corner of the main square. Sergio knew the family somehow, and one night I was supposed to stay with them. I was dancing and drinking these little glasses of wine that you could buy in any bar, restaurant, or cafe for 1 peseta. Sergio came to collect me because the house was going to be locked at midnight. I went back with him. I was having way too much fun, so I climbed out the window on the second floor and managed to get down to dance some more. We picked one day to run in front of the bulls. I really wanted to be in the mix, but we started running too soon and got to the bull ring before the bulls. I was both disappointed and relieved. In the ring, they let out some cows with horns, who were nowhere near as ferocious as the bulls. People were running around, swatting them with rolled-up newspaper, and then darting away. It was quite exciting, and I joined in and did that until they herded them out of the ring. Charlton Heston was there as the celebrity guest of honor. After that crazy week was over, I met these 2 high school kids, Rick and Jeff, camping at the campground who had a Volkswagen. They lived on a military base in Germany. I asked for a ride to Madrid, but they said the car was too full. So I said, if I can repack the car so I fit, will you take me? They said, okay. So I repacked the car, picked up my passport at the office, and we were off. I met Sergio and Peter at the youth hostel. I'd finally gotten my card in Paris. The 3 of us went to a bullfight, of course, and took a side trip to El Escorial. I think we took a bus. At one point, I bought a postcard that had a great view of it, and I wanted to find that view. So we tramped around in the fields until we found it. The next morning, I was having one of those conversations about how your passport photo doesn't really look like you with someone. We pulled out our passports. I looked at his. It was clearly him. Then he looked at mine. This really doesn't look like you, and I don't think it is you. It wasn't. The guy at the campground had given me the wrong one, and I hadn't checked. Sergio and I were planning to take the ferry from Gibraltar to Morocco, something I was really looking forward to. But you need a passport. Sergio called the campground and sorted everything out. We would mail the other guy's passport back to the campground, and they would mail my passport to the youth hostel in Granada. It wouldn't be in time to go to Morocco. Sergio had some kind of deadline to be back in Paris. The mail was really slow back then. Spain was a third world country. Then we set off for Granada. You can't hitch with 3 people, so I was alone. I got to within sight of the city, but it was night, so I wandered into a field and slept between rows of some kind of vegetable. By this time I also had what we called a schlafsack. It was a cotton liner bag that the youth hostels made you use. So I had bought one. In the morning, I awoke and saw that the field was full of women picking the vegetable, but they had picked around me, letting me sleep. You could see the Alhambra and Granada on the hillside from where I was lying. I was quite moved. I thanked the women and walked into town. One night we went to a flamenco club, and predictably the dancers got me up on stage to dance with them. It was a gimmick, so I didn't mind. Then they posed with me. Jose Manuel Gonzalez Navarro was one of the boys who helped run the youth hostel. I have his incredible flourish of a signature in my address book. So Sergio and I decided to hitch to Sevilla instead of going to Morocco. He had a letter waiting there, probably from some woman. Peter didn't want to come along, but he lent me his lucky bowler for the trip. It took a while to get there. The best ride of my life was on a donkey. 2 melon farmers were returning from market, and having sold their melons, had 2 unladen donkeys. We rode for about 5 miles. They invited us to come with them to their village, somewhere up in the hills. Could have been fun, but we declined. In those days, very few Spaniards owned cars. Our rides came from French or German tourists in their deux chevaux and Volkswagens. Even so, there were not many cars on the road, so we spent a lot of time under trees waiting. We were under a bush or a tree somewhere, and Sergio decided to teach me a song about Sevilla. I had learned enough Spanish to understand and memorize the words, but since Sergio was completely tone deaf, it was really hard to figure out the melody. I didn't get it completely right, but this is how I learned it. Sevilla tuvo que ser con su lunita plateada, cuna de nuestro amor bajo la noche estrellada. Y nos quisimos tú y yo con un amor sin pecado. Pero el destino ha querido que vivamos separados. We spent one night in Córdoba. We made it to Sevilla, and for some reason decided to sleep in the Parque de Maria Luisa. It was closed, and there was a rather high fence around it. So we climbed over and found a place to sleep under some bushes near a statue of Glorieta de Becker. This was in the time of Franco, and all the police wore these 3-cornered hats. And sure enough, in the middle of the night, the police arrived. Just at that moment, as we were scrambling to our feet, an ant went into Sergio's ear. He said, "There's an ant in my ear." But then he lost the ability to talk and was just howling and writhing in distress. I was trying to explain to the guy in the 3-cornered hat that Sergio had an ant in his ear, but I didn't know the word for ant. Sergio, ¿cómo se dice ant? It went on like that for a while. Finally he said, "Hormiga." "Ah," said the police. After Sergio got the ant out, instead of arresting us, he suggested that we would be more comfortable on one of the marble benches. Not what we expected.
Están clavadas los cruces en el monte del olvido por 2 amores que han muerto, que son el tuyo y el mío.
The next morning, Sergio picked up his letter and we set off back to Granada to meet up with Peter. But we were in for an unpleasant surprise. Out where the highway began on the outskirts of town, there was a line of maybe 20 or so other hitchhikers, mostly German as far as I could tell. We spent the whole day in the queue and very few of us got rides. We kept hitching, hoping that we would be picked up from near the back of the line because of our beauty or the hats or whatever. We spent the entire day there and then slept right there so as not to lose our place. But it seemed so hopeless that the next day we moved to a different road, one with less traffic, but we hoped with fewer hitchhikers. We weren't the only ones with that idea. That day was kind of a nightmare. It was really hot and it made us unbearably sleepy, so we took turns sleeping for 10 minutes. Using Sergio's watch to time it, I remember the sweetness of falling instantly asleep in the ditch and the shattering feeling of being awakened in 10 minutes. Torture. We walked quite a ways and found ourselves near a watermelon farm. So we stole a watermelon. Man, was that good. To conserve money, we were mostly eating tomato sandwiches. You could buy a roll and a tomato in these little restaurants where the smell from the jugs of homemade olive oil was pervasive and wonderful. Sergio had two great laws of traveling. One, accept whatever you were offered, and two, get everyone's address. Toward evening on the second day, I was hitching and Sergio was getting his 10 minutes. And of course I was wearing the hat. There were other hitchhikers nearby, and we were not first in the line, but a red convertible, some kind of Italian car, went by and then slowed to a stop and backed up. The driver looked at me and asked if I was from Chile. No, but I have one right here. Sergio, wake up. It turned out this man worked in Rome for the UN and had been in the Chilean embassy recently when people were passing around pictures of Sergio wearing the Charlie Chaplin hat, probably with girls and probably with Peter. The other hitchhikers glared at us as we sped off in a sports car. He must have turned off toward Malaga because we found ourselves in the middle of nowhere, in the dark, with no cars passing. A farmer allowed us to sleep in his threshing circle. We pulled the chaff over us like a blanket. The next day we made it to Granada, where I got my passport and gave Peter his hat. We split up again and were supposed to meet in Barcelona, but I was late and they had already left. Peter and I had plans to meet in London. I stopped in Alicante and climbed up to the castle of Santa Barbara. The last ride I got into Barcelona was with the soon-to-be conductor of the Barcelona Symphony, Rafael Ferrer. He took me to his house and we had coffee, but I went on and stayed at the youth hostel. I was so new to the world of classical music that I didn't realize how unusual this was. I climbed to the top of La Familia Sagrada Cathedral by myself and went to a bullfight with some guys from the hostel. This was an amazing experience because I ended up translating from Spanish to both German and Danish. I'd finally been able to keep them all separate. I hitched with the Dane towards Provence. I remember one night somewhere between Spain and Nice, by the side of the road being devoured by mosquitoes. I had the Schlafsack over my face even though it was hot. I was on my way to see Lorenza. I spent a couple of days in Nice. The beach across from the Hotel Palais de la Méditerranée was just rocks. Where's the sand? One night there was a parade with floats. Maybe Mademoiselle Nice? At night I slept on and under a pile of mattresses that they would put out during the day for hotel guests to lie on. They were just stacked under the boardwalk. This guy was sleeping there too. Then I headed through Monaco to Torino, where Lorenza lived. I got to her building and tried to talk to the woman concierge, but she spoke none of my languages. When I got to German, she ran to find a man in the building who spoke some German. The situation was this. Every day she would come to look for me, or letters from me. Oh, la signorina! I had said that I would come in July, and I was late. It was August. Oh, la signorina. Now she was crying, and I was crying. Where is she? She went with her parents on vacation. Oh, la signorina. Every day she is looking for you. I had missed her, the person I most wanted to see in the whole world. Well, there was nothing to do but continue. I had promised my brother Jonathan that I would buy him a record of Peppino di Capri. So I found a record store and spent an amusing time with a cute salesgirl trying to communicate. I was speaking my primitive Spanish and she was speaking Italian, and every once in a while we would understand a word or two. And finally, I had her mail it to the U.S. That evening, I got to the tiny town of Pero and got stuck as it got dark. There were no more cars. I was standing across from a restaurant, and after a while a boy my age came out and we talked. I don't remember how. Where are you going? To Geneva, Switzerland. But there are no cars. Where will you sleep? Maybe right here in the field. Pretty soon they brought me a plate of spaghetti. Yum. Then the local dentist appeared and said I could sleep in his dentist chair. I was so excited. Wait till I tell Sergio. Half the town trooped into the dentist's office to watch me try it out. It's perfect, I said. But then the dentist had second thoughts and invited me to his house where he had a spare bed. Damn, I was so disappointed. I hitched on to Switzerland, and on the way over and under the Alps, got picked up by two Italian maniacs in a green Lancia sports car with right side drive. Aye, crazy tunnels and those old middle passing lanes. It's okay if no one is coming. Ha, someone is always coming. And we barely missed death countless times. I was dropped in this tiny village in the mountains where there was a bakery. I went in and bought some bread and started talking to the baker. It was late and he offered to let me sleep in the bakery in a sort of loft up over the oven. It was toasty warm up there, and in the morning I was awakened by the intoxicating smell of baking bread. In Geneva, I visited my parents' oldest friends, the Arbuthnot's, and my childhood playmate, Lucy, their daughter. She and I went to a spectacular fireworks display over the lake. I went on towards Grenoble, where my friend from Paris, Dick Sutton, was now studying. Dick and I hung out for a few days. His classes hadn't started, so we decided to climb a nearby mountain. We used a cable to get up this cliff. At the top, I let go of the cable and pulled on a small tree, which came out in my hand. I barely managed to grab the cable instead of tumbling down the cliff. This was a year before I learned to rock climb. We met a couple of Swedish girls one night and spent a lot of time kissing. Mine was named Gunborg Liljekvist, but of course we referred to her as Gunboy. The friend, the third girl, was pissed. I finally set off for London to meet Peter. I bypassed Paris and went straight to Calais, stopping only once to tour a castle. The famous crossing was rough, and I spent most of the time out on deck. I wanted a photo of me at the rail and asked an innocent bystander to snap it. He was peering through the old viewfinder on my Argus C3 camera when a very seasick guy came running out of the main salon and tried to puke over the side, but didn't quite make it, and the wind carried it right into the face of the guy taking the picture. I felt bad, but what could I do? Anyway, he screwed up the picture. In London, I went to the address I had for Fifi and Filippa, my friends from southern Rhodesia, who taught me the nursery rhyme, Ini mabili matatu, mamba bamba zinzi, zinzi ini ufili, ini mabili matatu. It sounds nice, but it's actually about a dead child. Turns out, they had given the apartment to a bunch of Australians. I said, I'm sorry. They were going to give me a place to stay, and turned to go, but the Australian said, no worries, you can stay here. It was two couples and a single guy. We all went out to Hampton Court one day. One of the women was looking to break into musical comedy. She developed this thing about me. Nothing ever happened, but one day when we were alone in the apartment, she had me down on the floor doing relaxation techniques. First relax your toes, now your feet, now your ankles, now your calves, etc. She was leaning over me, directing my relaxation, and it was extremely intimate. The single guy was studying flamenco guitar in London. He taught me the flamenco roll with all four fingers. I found Peter through the American Express, and we did some touring. I also located my Irish nurse girlfriend from Westendorf, but she definitely did not have the vacation party spirit thing going. One day, Peter and I spent some time in front of a tube station, making fun of the men wearing bowler hats. He ended up giving me his hat. I randomly bought a golden cloth coat that had hearts, horns, buttons. Sort of an Anglo-Austrian kind of thing. When I left London, I underestimated the time it would take to hitch to Harwich to catch the ferry to Hook of Holland. This became a serious problem because I needed to take that overnight ferry in order to be on time for the sailing of my ship, the Groot Beer, from Rotterdam. It got later and later, and I still had a long way to go when a tenor sax player on his way to a gig in Harwich stopped for me. He took off, and we made it to the boat just as they were about to pull up the gangplank. He went way out of his way. Musicians. I wandered around Rotterdam that day and spent the night in the youth hostel. The city had been leveled by Allied bombings during the war, and they were just starting to make progress in rebuilding. It had a weird feeling, with lots of open spaces and new construction. The next morning, I boarded the Groot Beer. The first thing I did was get rid of my shoes. They were the bane of all the shoeshine boys in Spain, barely holding together anywhere and with the soles coming off. I switched to the sandals I had bought in Spain. The Groot Beer was a student ship, completely overcrowded, but since it was only for students, really fun. Again, everyone was older than I was. Either Europeans heading to the States to study or Americans having graduated from college and bought their Volkswagen and driven around Europe for the summer, heading home. But I still had fun. I became friends with this one guy who knew my Mount Hermon dance band member Dave Owen. If he lost a point in ping pong, he threw the paddle overboard. Later it was deck chairs. There was a real jazz band on board, mainly students from Manhattan School of Music. The pianist, Benny, showed me the chords that McCoy Tyner used in this recording of Billy Boy, which I loved. Upon arriving in New York Harbor, we were too late to dock. Not surprising. So the band moved out on deck and we danced until dawn. What did this year mean to me? Everything.